point to move to the other big object of analysis of public health. So we've seen the health conditions. We've tried to define what is health, what are health needs. We've analyzed how you can approach the measurement challenge here, and we've seen the dynamics, right? Now we move to the second big object, which is the organized social response through what we call health systems. This has not always been part of public health, by the way. In its origins, public health was pretty much about understanding the distribution of health conditions, and then initially it was focused on a narrower set of social responses, right? What are called public health services, a subset of services, typically either intervening on the environment, what was called public hygiene, or on personal hygiene behaviors and attitudes, but mostly behaviors of people. But as formal differentiated health systems grew, the scope of public health also grew, and already in the 20s and 30s, it was clear that understanding not just a subset of health services that could be called public health services, but the entirety of health services, including personal health services, services that have to do with the diagnosis and treatment of diseases, was under the purview of public health, because not in their in their technical medical aspects, but in the way they are organized as a key set of institutions in a society, and therefore a big part of what shapes the health of populations, which is in the end the focus of public health. So today, in any school of public health, you'll find departments of health policy and management that try to understand how the full array of health services are organized, financed, delivered, and that's the field of health systems in a broader sense. Now, the public health became interested because health systems started growing. There's always been, as I mentioned before, has always been some form of social response to health conditions. But it's really, although there's some beginnings before that, it's really after the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, that you start seeing this growth in differentiated, specialized institutions focusing strictly on maintaining health and then diagnosis and treating disease. Prior to that, the social function of caring for sick people and conserving health was basically discharged by undifferentiated institutions like the family or religious institutions. And it's in the 20th century that we begin to think about a set of, as I said, differentiated and specialized institutions. Think, for example, that hospitals, that today, we think of hospitals as a main place where we go to get treated, and most of us expect to come alive out of a hospital. That's a recent phenomenon. Hospitals were not places you went to be treated and cured. They were places you went to die, basically, and especially if you were destitute, homeless. Hospitals were places for sheltering the poor. And they didn't become therapeutic spaces, therapeutic organizations, until really the 20th century. Some early beginnings of that, but it's really in the 20th century. So this is what I call this the second health revolution of the 20th century, because we always talk about the health revolution of the 20th century as the huge decline in mortality, the rise in life expectancy, the shift from acute, mostly infectious diseases to non-communicable diseases, everything that we saw under the rubric of the epidemiologic transition. And that was a big revolution. But this is a second revolution. It's the emergence of this differentiated set of organizations that are devoted specifically to the function of preserving, protecting, promoting health, and then diagnosing and treating illness. So what we see today is, these entities called health systems, and they have multiple elements of importance in every society in the world. Today, these health systems represent a very large sector of the economy. With huge consequences for the functioning of the rest of the economy. But what is the largest sector of the U.S. economy today, which is still the largest economy in the world, not for long, but it's still the largest economy. What is the largest sector of the U.S. economy?
It's healthcare.
It is healthcare. It is larger. It is up 18%, coming close now to $3 trillion. So the largest sector of the largest economy in the world is the healthcare industry. But even globally, healthcare represents about 10% of the world economy. So it is also a large sector of the global economy. This is about $6.5 trillion. Okay? Reflecting this, it's a major source of employment and livelihood for literally tens of millions of specialized health workers. All of us here are part of that. But it's literally tens of millions of people who devote their entire life to the functions of, the social response. The largest employer in Europe, in this unified Europe, is not a Franco-German chemical consortium. It's a public corporation called the National Health Service in the UK, okay, which is actually the third largest employer in the world. But even here in the US, just think about how many people find in the health system their major source of livelihood. It is, of course, as you were already anticipating, a hugely important political arena, right? And I mean, Gabe mentioned, the debates among, this is the central topic of domestic U.S. policies, but throughout the world you find this. Almost every election, this will be an issue in the platforms of parties and so forth. It is, of course, if you think societally, a major motor for innovation. Obviously technological innovation, but also organizational innovations. I mean, just think of how different the health system looks today than, say, at the beginning of the 20th century, where you had a few, relatively undifferentiated organizations, and today you have this plethora of different entities and organizations involved. And then just think of the technological dimension. It is, in fact, the main point of contact for the common citizen with the fruits of science and technological development. And probably the most consequential point of contact with science. It's where the common citizen most directly and as I say, consequentially experiences the fruits of this huge part of the larger health system, which is the investment in research and development. And then as we were analyzing last time when we were talking about the determinants of health, the health system has become a source of cultural interpretations. Where we interpret events of life like birth, suffering, pain, loss, death in specialized medical terms, right? What's being called the medicalization of life. Or behaviors like, criminal behavior or addictions. We put them out of a either religious explanatory framework or a criminal justice framework, and we place them squarely in a health framework. So, we live in a society where a lot of activities that were not considered part of the health system, like bringing up children, like nutrition, like physical activity, like sexual behavior, etc., become part of the scope of health systems. And then last but not least, this is a space for ethical deliberation, where some of the most pressing ethical dilemmas of our societies are addressed and play out. You know, questions about life and death, the beginning and the end of life. Questions about resource allocation. I mean, what do you give priority to in a society? Where do you put your resources? Very, very important ethical questions get sorted out, or sometimes not, but get at least debated in the context of this set of health systems. So this is why it is important to understand the health system. There's no, by the way, many people have noted that there is no industry of this size that operates with such an incredible lack of understanding and measurement of its main products, right? I mean, you can run almost anything else, and yet, you know, part of what we try to do here, and what I hope you will be leading, is to, you know, develop ways of actually understanding what happens with all of these resources, all of this employment, all of this political debate and ethical deliberations. What are the actual products of this, and what is the impact on the health conditions of populations? So this is why it's important to understand systems, and these are complex systems. So health systems are complex systems. The word system is a very, very commonly used. It's used in engineering, we speak of systems biology, systems engineering. It is a very dominant way of thinking. There's general systems theory, which tries to understand the properties of systems independently of what are the specific components and so forth. We're going to try to at least get a glimpse, but try to relate it specifically to health systems. We're not going to dwell with the larger and more abstract, but for anyone who's interested, this is a fascinating field. In our case, in health, I think this idea of trying to tackle the complexity of systems in an organized, systematic way has been hampered by three very common misunderstandings. And you know, I call these understandings the idea that health systems are a black box, or they are a black hole, or they are simply a laundry list of elements. And let me just say, you know, the black box misconception which is very prevalent, this idea that these systems are hugely complex. We're never going to understand how all the pieces operate. And it's a very tempting solution to say, let's just get the technologies out there. It's very much, you know, people who really believe in the power of magic bullets. Let's just get the vaccines, the specific technologies, and somehow, you know, things will work themselves out, and we will see some result. Okay, and we really don't care what happens, you know, inside the black box, which is the health system. Actually, you know, we have advanced a lot. We can open the black box, look into the black box, and try to understand what are its components and how they interrelate with each other. And the one thing we know, the one empirical generalization we have, is that health systems in countries with exactly the same income per capita, and countries that spend exactly the same amount of money per person in their health system, achieve widely different results. So what happens inside really matters. And you know, we see it all around. It's not because they're poor and rich countries, or because countries spend more or less. With exactly the same income, exactly the same expenditures in health, we get widely different results. Or worse, you know, the US, which spends much more than any other industrialized and gets the worst results. It's very important to understand what's happening. It's not just an issue that if you put human resources and technology and money on one side, you'll get outcomes on the other side, and you really don't need to worry about understanding. And the science of health systems, I think, has advanced sufficiently. The black hole is another common misconception, and it's the idea that, this comes obviously from the field of astronomy, that no matter how much resources you put into health systems, they'll just absorb them, and very little comes at the other end. This is something that famous sociologist Paul Starr called the doctrine of therapeutic nihilism. The idea that it doesn't matter, because it's really the social determinants that matter, and all of what we do here is not really going to contribute that much. And it is true that the social determinants matter, but as we will see, a good health system manages the social determinants as well. It's not one or the other. But this is a very, very common misconception. And it is clear that there are some very inefficient health systems where no matter how much you put in, you get very little in terms of real impact on health, but that's not uniformly true. So again, understanding is good. And then the laundry list misconception is the idea that you just list the components here. The hospitals, a little bit, let's list the pieces. And this is a necessary but not sufficient condition. Because what defines a health system is not just the elements, it's the relationships among the elements. And that is the key. So the alternative to any of this is taking a relational view, understanding that systems are bundles of relationships, of structured relationships among different elements. So a relational view. And as we will see, the key element is that a health system can be better understood as a set of structured relationships between two major components: a population and a set of specialized institutions. And it's how they relate that actually matters the most. And this is what we're going to be doing. So what we will try to do, this is in the rest of today, we have 3 more blocks, is answer 5 key questions to understand health systems, okay? The first is, what is a health system, right? And this is very much the exercise of your thought paper and of today. What are the boundaries? What are the actors, and what are those relationships between the actors? Second is, what are health systems for? Every system has an aim. Now, the aim may not be completely shared. It doesn't necessarily imply that every actor shares exactly the same aims. Systems are compatible with notions of conflict, okay, and internal tension. There's a school of thought that thinks that systems are always self-preserving and adaptive, and that there's no inconsistent. That's not my view and the view of many people. But one can articulate a set of goals for a health system, and that's the second big question that we will be talking about today. The third is, what are the functions that the health system needs to carry out in order to achieve the goals? And the way those functions get structured defines the architecture of a system. But the first thing is, what are these crucial functions of a health system? And if we understand, the boundaries, the goals, the functions, then the next big question is, how well does the system perform? How good is the system? And this is the concept of performance. We want to understand how well does the system perform the functions, how well do those functions achieve the goal, and within what use of resources. And that's the notion of performance. And this we will see next time, next session. And then finally, the whole sort of holy grail of health system research is, how do we relate health systems architecture to performance? What configuration of functions with which actors performing which functions give us the best results? This is the science of health systems. And there is